Hi, I'm Phil Tuttle, and it's my joy to welcome you to Refuge, Finding Home in a World of Change. I've been working on this series for a couple of years now, and I'm so glad that we can finally bring it to you. Refuge is the newest study in Walk Through the Bible's Biblical Character series. And in our next 6 sessions together, we'll explore the book of Ruth, verse by verse. Oftentimes it's said that the devil is in the details. You know what? Lots of times the beauty is in the details, and we're going to discover that together. Jewish tradition credits Samuel with writing the book of Ruth. No, we don't really know for sure. This appears to be the most likely option. The writer was a very gifted storyteller. In fact, some consider Ruth to be the greatest short story ever written. Though Ruth was written about 3,000 years ago, I believe this brief book has never been more relevant than it is today. In our country, debates about immigration seem to dominate the news. Ongoing conflict caused by racial injustice is something that pulls at all of our hearts. And the tension between our nationalism and our faith. How do we balance our commitment to country with our commitment to God? Those are all just big topics in the book of Ruth. But you know what? There are also other things that we all deal with, themes that are in our lives that are timeless across cultures and across centuries. Themes like grief and loss and hope and love and confusion about what God's doing, and all of those things, we find all of those in the book of Ruth. So let's get started with session 1 that we call Losing Home. Ruth 1 lays out for us the background and setting of this book. And the first part of verse 1 simply says, "In the days when the judges ruled." So this is setting the time context for us. The days of the judges, it's 400 years where people of Israel learn and forget the same lessons over and over again, like they're just spinning their wheels for 4 centuries. And this period of time was characterized by a number of things. There was weak leadership, frequent turnovers in who was in charge. There was radical individualism. There wasn't overall agreement on what was right, and that's tied to the next one, which is no absolute truth. Well, I think this, and you think this, and your view of truth, I'm supposed to believe that it's equally valid to mine. Some of this may be starting to sound a bit familiar. There was a lot of idol worship, and there were frequent wars. There's just a political insecurity in the land. The last verse of the book of Judges summarizes just what that whole period was like. Remember, it was 400 years. And the last verse not only summarizes it, but kind of diagnoses the problem. It says, "In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit." Aren't you glad you don't live in a world like that? I'll bet back then they had to take a Gallup poll to decide if something was moral or immoral. Of course, we realize this is very similar to the world we're living in today. Back to Ruth 1, verse 1, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab." We'll talk later on about Moab and the relationship between Israel and Moab. It's pretty complex. We'll get into that later on. But I want you to notice here that they lived in Bethlehem. And ironically, Bethlehem means house of bread. House of bread. It was named after God's blessing, God's provision. But a famine came and forced the family to move to Moab. When I think about that, it makes me question the teaching that's so common, especially in our culture, and then we export it to the rest of the world, that says when you come into a relationship with God, you'll never struggle again. It's like you're Teflon coated. Problems come, but they don't stick. Here is a family living right in the heart, ground zero of God's work in the world at the time, Bethlehem, house of bread, and yet there's a famine. And what a reminder for us today that what sets us apart as believers in Jesus Christ is not the absence of problems, but God's presence in our life to help us through those problems. So they pack up, They go, and it says for a while, they're hoping just to be there, ride out the famine, and then come home. But they're displaced. You know, displacement is a common theme in human history. It happened in Bible times, it's happened throughout history, and it's big time happening today. Just a few examples. Jacob's family went to Egypt to find food. The early Christians in the book of Acts, that was the persecution that caused them to scatter. More recently, pilgrims came to the New World so that they could worship freely. And Africans were brought as slaves all the way over to North and Central and South America as maybe the ultimate example of displacement. Potato famine drove the Irish to come to America and other countries. More recently, Stalin exiled dissidents to Siberia. And even in our present generation, ISIS is forcing Syrians and Iraqis to flee for their lives. Conflict and poverty are driving Africans to migrate to Europe and far beyond. Displacement can be either voluntary or forced. But I think it's important we think of that not as two clear categories. Was this voluntary or was this forced? It's really easy if we're looking at somebody else's life from the outside to say, well, they just made that choice. They just wanted to be more comfortable. They just wanted an easier life. They didn't really have to migrate. But it's very different if you're the family going through that. And so what we really have here is a more of a continuum from voluntary to forced. I mean, if a family comes up from Central America, it's easy for us in North America to say, well, that's just a choice they're making for comfort. Really? Not always, because sometimes it's the drug cartels, the gangs that are just dominating the town where they live in. That family, if we get to know them, we find out they had 5 kids, 2 have already been lost in gang violence. Is that voluntary or is that forced? It's a continuum, not 2 clear categories. There's nothing new about displacement, but what's new is the unprecedented size and scope of global migration. In 2019, there were 272 million international migrants. Just think about that. That's over 250 million. That's 3.5% of all humans on Earth. And while 3.5 may not sound like a very high percentage, if we put it in terms that we understand here in the U.S., that's more than 80% of the population of our country. It's a huge number. Displacement can also be caused by more common events. It doesn't take a global crisis. It doesn't take a terrorist occupation of the land. Sometimes it can be an event as simple as education, when we decide to move cross-country to attend a college or university. When I was in 6th grade, my parents decided the private school I was going to, there was rumors it was going to close. We better move Philip to the public school. And that shouldn't have been a big deal, but it was to me, from moving from 6th grade to 7, from 60 kids in my class to now 400 or 500. I was displaced. I didn't know anybody. Employment can cause us to move clear across country. We follow the jobs where we live. Evacuation. I met a family the other day at a gas station. He just had this amazing Cajun accent. And I said, oh, are you just driving through? And he says, no, we've been here since Hurricane Katrina. This is our home now. We lost our home. Now we live here. Or estrangement. It can be the end of a marriage. It can be conflict between a parent and a child. Estrangement can cause displacement. Those and other things, this is a common theme. This is part of the human experience, especially in our generation when things are as mobile as they are. Verse 2, the story goes on and it says, the man's name was Elimelech and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and they lived there. It wasn't long after that until tragedy struck that family. Verse 3, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and there she was left with her 2 sons. So now Naomi is a widow and she's a single mom. Verse 4 says, they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. So things are looking up. Maybe there's hope for Naomi. No doubt she's still grieving the loss of her husband Elimelech, but now her sons have both found wives, and with these two marriages, maybe there's the hope of grandkids. But you know what? In verse 5, things take another tragic turn. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. So here's this woman. She's living in a foreign land. She doesn't know the customs. And she's got two daughters-in-law. I can't imagine a much tougher situation than this. Her displacement, it started as just physical, but Naomi's physical or geographical displacement later became relational, emotional, spiritual. And oftentimes those are the displacements, those are the grief experiences in our lives that are really the toughest. And by the way, it's possible for us, even without being displaced physically, even without a geographic move or migration, that we can still be displaced relationally, emotionally, or spiritually. So this theme of displacement that begins the book and sets the stage for everything, it's common in our lives today. And our responses to this shakes us to the very foundation. We may have deep trust in God, but when we're displaced, when we have the loss of things around us that are familiar, again, whether it's literally moving someplace else or whether it's just the closest friends that I have, let alone the family members, there's a break in that relationship. When that happens, that sense of displacement is one of the toughest trials that we as humans endure. As you talk in your groups at the end of this session, here's my question for you. And it's going to take some risk. It's going to take some vulnerability on this. Let's not just exchange a bunch of happy cliches that, look good on a plaque hanging on the wall, but do very poorly during the dark night of the soul. Let's talk real life stuff. Here's my question for you. What's the most difficult displacement, loss, or grief you've ever experienced? Think about that for a minute. For some of us, that's painful to jump back into those memories of an unwanted move or an unexpected job change, let alone the end of a relationship that was important to us. But think about what's the most difficult displacement, loss, or grief you've ever experienced. What made that time so challenging? Because I can almost guarantee if you dig deep and you share openly, there's somebody else in your group that's going to resonate with. And if you're talking past tense, it's very likely that God has put your group together so that what you've experienced in past tense, somebody's dealing with right now in present tense. So share freely, share honestly. May there be great authenticity as you talk about this in your group. Go for it.